December 23rd, 1944. The sky above the Ardennes cleared for the first time in a week, revealing a landscape transformed by 8 days of desperate combat. Sepp Dietrich, commander of the 6th Panzer Army, stood beside a frozen road watching what remained of his armored columns stretched across the Belgian countryside. Then he heard them. The sound came from the west, a distant drone that grew into a roar as hundreds of Allied aircraft filled the suddenly cloudless sky. Dietrich had commanded SS Panzer Division since the invasion of Russia. He'd seen the tide turn at Kursk, watched Germany's offensive power bleed away across the Eastern Front. But he'd never seen anything like what unfolded that morning. American fighter-bombers descended on his stalled columns with methodical precision. Trucks exploded, tanks burned. Men scattered into the woods seeking cover that didn't exist. Within hours, the roads his army needed to advance became graveyards of twisted metal and charred vehicles. He turned to his staff officers, his voice carrying the flat certainty of a man watching his worst fears confirmed. "It's over," he said. "We'll never reach the Meuse now." 7 days earlier, Adolf Hitler had stood before his senior commanders in the Eagle's Nest and unveiled what he called the war's decisive operation. The plan was breathtaking in its ambition. 30 divisions, including 10 panzer divisions, would smash through the weakly held American lines in the Ardennes forest. They would cross the Meuse River, drive northwest to Antwerp, split the Allied armies in two, and potentially force the Western Allies to negotiate peace. Hitler spoke with absolute conviction, his voice rising as he described how this single stroke would reverse Germany's fortunes and buy time to deploy new wonder weapons that would change the war's trajectory. Field Marshal Gerd von Rundstedt, nominal commander of all German forces in the West, sat through this presentation with the expression of a man attending his own funeral. At 69 years old, Rundstedt represented the old Prussian military aristocracy. He'd commanded armies in Poland, France, and Russia. He understood operational reality in ways that Hitler, for all his intuition and willpower, never had. When Hitler finished speaking and asked for questions, Rundstedt said nothing. He'd learned that arguing with the Führer was pointless, but in private conversations with his staff, Rundstedt made his assessment clear. He called the operation "this damned offensive," and told subordinates he didn't believe it could succeed. The plan required capturing Allied fuel dumps because Germany couldn't provide enough fuel for the advance. It required clear weather to prevent Allied air power from intervening. It required breakthrough and exploitation at a pace that Germany's depleted forces could no longer achieve. Most fundamentally, it required the Americans to collapse when attacked, something Rundstedt knew they wouldn't do. Rundstedt and Field Marshal Walter Model, commander of Army Group B, had proposed an alternative they called the small solution. Instead of driving all the way to Antwerp, their plan called for a limited offensive to reach the Meuse River, encircle and destroy American forces in the Ardennes, then establish a defensive line. It was achievable. It would inflict serious losses on the Americans. It wouldn't end the war, but it might delay the Allied advance into Germany by months. Hitler rejected this plan completely. He wanted Antwerp or nothing. The small solution, he said, would accomplish nothing strategically. Only a blow that split the Allied armies and captured their main supply port could change the war's trajectory. When Rundstedt tried to argue, Hitler cut him off. The decision was made. On the morning of December the 16th, German artillery opened fire across a front 60 miles wide. The bombardment shattered the winter quiet of the Ardennes, sending American troops scrambling for cover in a sector they'd considered a quiet rest area. Then the infantry came, followed by the panzers, pushing through gaps in the American line, exploiting the surprise and confusion. For 3 days, the offensive achieved stunning tactical success. Entire American units were surrounded. Thousands of prisoners were taken. German spearheads drove deep into Belgium, their advance measured in miles per day, rather than the yards per week that had become normal on the Western Front. At Hitler's headquarters, the mood approached euphoria. The Führer's intuition had been proven correct again. The Americans were breaking. But the field commanders saw different reality. Hasso von Manteuffel, commanding the 5th Panzer Army in the center of the offensive, watched his advance slow as fuel ran short. The Germans had calculated they needed 5 million gallons of fuel to reach Antwerp. They'd started the offensive with only 2.5 million gallons available. The plan required capturing American fuel dumps intact, but American engineers were destroying the dumps before German forces could reach them. Manteuffel had raised this concern directly with Hitler during a meeting on December 2nd. He'd explained that without guaranteed fuel supplies, the offensive would stall before reaching its objectives. Hitler had dismissed the concern. The Americans would be routed, he said. They would abandon their supplies in panic. The fuel would be there. By December 20th, Manteuffel's spearheads were running on fumes. His lead divisions had advanced 40 miles, but they'd used fuel at rates higher than planned because of poor road conditions and constant combat. The American fuel dumps they'd counted on capturing had been destroyed. His tanks were stopping not because of American resistance, but because they had no fuel to continue. To the north, Dietrich's 6th Panzer Army faced even worse problems. His route of advance ran through heavily wooded terrain, crossed by few good roads. The waist-deep snow Dietrich would later describe made off-road movement nearly impossible. His 6 armored divisions couldn't deploy properly. They bunched up on narrow roads, creating massive traffic jams that prevented supplies from reaching the front and stopped reinforcements from exploiting breakthroughs. And the Americans weren't breaking. This became clear within 48 hours of the offensive's start. Individual units were surrounded and destroyed, yes, but the American army as a whole responded with speed and coordination that shocked German commanders. Reinforcements moved toward the Ardennes immediately. Patton's Third Army began a 90-degree turn northward to strike the German southern flank. Most critically, the Americans held Bastogne, a critical road junction that the German plan required for continued advance. Model recognized the significance of Bastogne immediately. On December 20th, when German forces surrounded the town, he urged the American commander there to surrender. The American response was a single word: nuts. Model didn't understand the American slang, but he understood the defiance it represented. As long as the Americans held Bastogne, German supply lines would be strangled. The offensive couldn't continue. Model was 54 years old, a generation younger than Rundstedt, and he'd built his reputation as Hitler's favorite defensive specialist. He'd stabilized collapsing fronts in Russia multiple times. He understood both military reality and how to manage Hitler's expectations. By December 22nd, Model was telling his staff that Antwerp was no longer achievable. The question now was whether they could reach the Meuse River and establish a defensive position there, salvaging something from the offensive. Then the weather changed. For a week, heavy clouds had blanketed the Ardennes, grounding Allied aircraft and allowing German forces to move during daylight without facing air attack. German commanders had counted on this weather continuing. When meteorologists predicted clearing skies, experienced officers felt their stomachs tighten. They'd all seen what Allied air power could do. December 23rd brought crystalline blue skies. Within hours, Allied aircraft filled the air. Fighter bombers attacked German columns continuously. Heavy bombers struck road junctions and supply dumps. Transport aircraft dropped supplies to the surrounded Americans in Bastogne. The effect was devastating and immediate. Dietrich watched his 6th Panzer Army essentially stop moving. His tanks, already short on fuel, couldn't advance on roads cratered by bombs and blocked by destroyed vehicles. His supply columns, essential for any continued advance, were shredded by air attacks. By nightfall on December 23rd, Dietrich knew his army would advance no further. He'd later described this day with bitter sarcasm, noting that Hitler had expected him to cross a river, capture Brussels, and take Antwerp during the shortest days of the year with no air cover and insufficient fuel. "My tanks can't fight at night," he said in post-war interrogation, his voice dripping with contempt for the planning that had sent his men into this impossible operation. 3 days later, on December 26th, Patton's Third Army broke through to Bastogne. The siege was lifted. The Americans who'd held the town could be resupplied and reinforced. More critically, the southern flank of the German advance was now under sustained attack from a force that would only grow stronger. Model called a conference of his army commanders on December 27th. They met in a bunker near the front, close enough to hear artillery fire. Model asked each commander for an honest assessment. Could they reach Antwerp? Could they reach the Meuse? Should they continue attacking or begin withdrawing to defensible positions? Manteuffel spoke first. His 5th Panzer Army had advanced the deepest, coming within 4 miles of the Meuse River at one point. But that was as far as they would get. His units were out of fuel, low on ammunition, and facing growing American pressure from 3 directions. Continuing the attack would accomplish nothing except higher casualties. He recommended immediate withdrawal to the West Wall, Germany's fortified border defenses. Dietrich agreed. His 6th Panzer Army had barely advanced at all. The terrain, the weather, the fuel shortages, and now the overwhelming Allied air power made further offensive action impossible. His divisions needed to pull back before they were encircled themselves. Model listened, then summarized the military reality. The offensive had failed to achieve its objectives. Antwerp was unreachable. The Meuse was unreachable. The Americans had not collapsed. Allied air power had returned. Fuel was critically short. Ammunition was running low. The only question was whether to withdraw now in good order or continue attacking until the army was destroyed. But Model knew this assessment, however accurate, meant nothing without Hitler's approval, and Hitler had shown no indication that he understood or accepted the offensive's failure. Model drafted a report for the High Command, carefully worded to convey the seriousness of the situation without directly stating that the Führer's grand plan had failed. He requested permission to transition to defensive operations. At Hitler's headquarters, the mood remained disconnected from reality at the front. Hitler spent hours studying maps, moving pins representing divisions, planning new attacks that would break through to the Meuse. When Model's report arrived on December 28th, Hitler called a meeting of his senior military staff. General Alfred Jodl, chief of the Wehrmacht operations staff, attended this meeting. Jodl had helped plan the Ardennes Offensive. He'd supported Hitler's ambitious goals over the more limited objectives proposed by the field commanders. But Jodl could read military reports. He knew the offensive had stalled. He knew the Americans were counterattacking. He knew continued offensive operations would destroy the forces Germany needed for defense. The meeting began with Hitler demanding explanations for why the offensive hadn't reached Antwerp. He blamed the weather, blamed the terrain, blamed individual commanders for lack of drive and determination. He insisted the offensive could still succeed if his generals showed proper National Socialist willpower. Jodl tried to present the facts. Allied air power had destroyed German mobility. Fuel shortages had immobilized entire divisions. American reinforcements were arriving faster than German forces could be supplied. The window for offensive success had closed. Hitler rejected this assessment completely. The offensive would continue. New attacks would be launched. The Meuse would be reached. Antwerp would be taken. When Jodl suggested that perhaps a limited withdrawal might preserve forces for future operations, Hitler's rage exploded. There would be no withdrawal, no retreat. The offensive would continue until it succeeded. Field Marshal Wilhelm Keitel, chief of the Wehrmacht High Command, sat silent during this exchange. Keitel had earned the nickname Locketel among other officers, a play on Lakai, meaning lackey, for his servile agreement with everything Hitler said. He offered no support for Jodl's attempt at realism. When Hitler finished speaking, Keitel simply nodded and said the Führer's assessment was correct. The meeting ended with Hitler's order: continue offensive operations, prepare new attacks, reach the Meuse River. Model received these orders the next day. He read them, set them aside, and began planning defensive positions. He would make token attacks to satisfy Hitler's demands, but he would not destroy his army group pursuing objectives that no longer existed. Rundstedt, receiving the same orders at his headquarters, reacted with weary resignation. In private conversation with his chief of staff, he said what he'd known from the beginning: the offensive had been impossible from the start. Hitler had been living in fantasy. The field marshals had no say in strategic decisions anymore. They were simply expected to execute whatever Hitler ordered, regardless of military reality. But Rundstedt also understood something that the younger, more ideologically committed officers didn't fully grasp. Hitler couldn't admit the offensive had failed, because admitting failure meant admitting the war was lost. The Ardennes Offensive represented Germany's last reserves, the final gamble with forces that couldn't be replaced. If this operation failed to change the strategic situation, there were no more cards to play. The Western Allies would continue advancing, the Soviets would continue advancing. Germany would be crushed between them. So Hitler clung to the belief that the offensive could still succeed, that one more push would break through, that willpower could overcome material reality. To accept the offensive's failure was to accept Germany's defeat. Hitler wasn't psychologically capable of that acceptance. Not yet. Throughout early January, German forces in the Ardennes fought increasingly desperate defensive battles. The Americans attacked from north and south, squeezing the salient, retaking ground that had been captured in December. German casualties mounted. Equipment was lost. Divisions that had started the offensive with full strength were reduced to fragment. Model managed this fighting withdrawal with considerable skill, preventing the encirclement that American commanders hoped to achieve. But he was fighting for time, not victory. Every day the Germans held positions in Belgium was another day they weren't preparing defenses on German soil. Every tank destroyed in the Ardennes was one less tank available to defend the Rhine River. On January 8th, Hitler finally acknowledged reality, though not explicitly. He ordered the 6th Panzer Army withdrawn from the Ardennes and transferred to Hungary, where Soviet forces threatened Germany's last significant oil reserves. This decision effectively ended the Ardennes Offensive, though Hitler never issued a formal order admitting failure or authorizing general withdrawal. Model understood the significance immediately. The transfer of the 6th Panzer Army meant Hitler had given up on breakthrough in the West. The remaining forces in the Ardennes would fight delaying actions while withdrawing to the German border. The offensive that was supposed to change the war's trajectory had instead consumed Germany's last mobile reserves and achieved nothing strategically. He called his army commanders together one final time in mid-January. The meeting was brief. Model told them the 6th Panzer Army was being withdrawn. The remaining forces would conduct fighting withdrawal to the West Wall. There would be no more offensive operations. Their mission now was to preserve as much combat power as possible for the defense of Germany itself. Manteuffel asked the question everyone was thinking. Had it been worth it? They'd advanced 40 miles at the deepest point of penetration. They'd inflicted perhaps 80,000 American casualties. They'd delayed the Allied advance by perhaps 6 weeks. But they'd lost over 100,000 men themselves, lost tanks and equipment that couldn't be replaced, and consumed fuel and ammunition reserves needed for defending German territory. What had been gained? Model had no answer. The offensive had been Hitler's decision, not his. He'd executed his orders as well as circumstances permitted. But he knew, as did everyone in that room, that the Ardennes Offensive had been Germany's last throw of the dice, and the dice had come up short. By January 25th, German forces had withdrawn from all the territory they'd captured in December. The front line was essentially where it had been on December 15th, before the offensive began. The Wehrmacht had expended its last reserves and gained nothing except temporary disruption of Allied plans. Rundstedt submitted his final report on the offensive to the High Command. It was a masterpiece of careful language, presenting facts without explicitly stating conclusions that might enrage Hitler. The report noted the offensive's initial successes, the difficulties encountered, the enemy's response, and the current situation. Nowhere did it say the offensive failed. But every fact presented led to that inescapable conclusion. Hitler never formally responded to this report. He'd already moved on psychologically, focusing on the defense of Germany itself, planning new operations with forces that didn't exist, convinced that new weapons or political changes would still somehow avert defeat. In March, as American forces crossed the Rhine River and Soviet forces drove toward Berlin, Rundstedt was finally relieved of command. He'd overseen the loss of France, the failure of the Ardennes Offensive, and the collapse of Germany's western defenses. Hitler blamed him for these failures, though Rundstedt had opposed or doubted every major decision that led to them. Model remained in command of Army Group B as it was encircled in the Ruhr industrial region. On April the 21st, with his army group disintegrating and surrender imminent, Model walked into a forest and shot himself. He left a letter explaining that a field marshal should not be taken prisoner and that he saw no future in a defeated Germany. His suicide was perhaps the final acknowledgement of what he'd known since December. The Ardennes Offensive had been Germany's last chance, and it had failed. Manteuffel survived the war and provided detailed accounts of the offensive in post-war interrogations. He described the planning, the execution, the moment when he realized it would fail. When asked what single factor had been most decisive in the offensive's failure, he didn't hesitate. "Fuel," he said. "We never had enough fuel. Everything else followed from that." Dietrich also survived, though he was tried and imprisoned for war crimes committed by units under his command. In his interrogations about the Ardennes Offensive, his bitterness was palpable. He described the impossible task he'd been given, the inadequate resources provided, the fantasy planning that ignored basic military realities. "All I had to do," he said with heavy sarcasm, "was cross a river, capture Brussels, and then go on to take the port of Antwerp." Jodl and Keitel were tried at Nuremberg for war crimes. Both were convicted and hanged. During their trials, prosecutors presented evidence of their roles in planning aggressive war, including the Ardennes Offensive. Neither expressed regret about the offensive itself, only about Germany's defeat. Jodl maintained until his execution that the offensive had been militarily sound and had failed only because of factors beyond German control. The question of when German high command realized the Ardennes Offensive had failed has no single answer because different commanders realized it at different times, and Hitler never fully accepted it. Field commanders like Dietrich and Manteuffel knew by December 23rd that breakthrough was impossible. Model acknowledged by December 24th that Antwerp was unreachable. Rundstedt had doubted success from the beginning and saw his doubts confirmed within days of the offensive's start. But at the highest level, where strategic decisions were made, acceptance came slowly and incompletely. Jodl and Keitel recognized by late December that the offensive had stalled, but they couldn't or wouldn't contradict Hitler's insistence on continued attacks. Hitler himself never issued orders explicitly acknowledging failure. He simply shifted focus to other theaters, left the Ardennes forces to conduct fighting withdrawal, and moved on to planning operations that existed only in his imagination. The most honest assessment came from Rundstedt in a conversation with his chief of staff in early January. They were reviewing casualty reports, reading accounts of American counterattacks, calculating how long German forces could hold positions in Belgium. Rundstedt set down the papers and spoke with the tired clarity of a man who'd seen through the illusions from the start. "We gambled everything on this offensive," he said. "We told ourselves that if we could just reach Antwerp, split the Allied armies, the political situation would change. The Americans would negotiate. We'd buy time for new weapons to change the balance. We believed this because we needed to believe it, because the alternative was accepting that the war was lost." He paused, looking at the map on the wall, at the pins showing German positions being pushed steadily eastward. The offensive failed the moment it began, he continued, because it was based on assumptions that were never true. The Americans didn't panic. We didn't capture the fuel we needed. The weather didn't stay bad. And Antwerp was always too far, too ambitious, too much to ask of forces that had already given everything. His chief of staff asked when they should have realized this, when they should have stopped the offensive and withdrawn to save the forces being destroyed in Belgium. Rundstedt's answer was immediate. "We knew before it started," he said. "Model and I told them it wouldn't work. We proposed the small solution, the limited offensive that might have succeeded. But Hitler wanted the grand gesture, the dramatic victory that would change everything. So we attacked toward Antwerp. And here we are." This was the truth that German High Command grasped at different moments in late December and early January. The Ardennes Offensive had failed not because of weather or fuel or American resistance, though all those factors contributed. It had failed because it was designed to achieve impossible objectives with insufficient forces based on assumptions about enemy behavior that were never realistic. The failure was built into the plan from the beginning. The field commanders realized this when they watched their advances stop, when the fuel ran out, when Allied aircraft filled the cleared skies. The Army Group commanders realized it when they calculated distances to objectives and compared them to available resources. The High Command realized it when reports from the front contradicted Hitler's expectations. And Hitler realized it, if he ever truly did, only when he quietly shifted the 6th Panzer Army to another theater and stopped talking about Antwerp. What German High Command said when they realized the Ardennes Offensive had failed was mostly said in private, in careful language designed not to trigger Hitler's rage, in conversations that weren't recorded but were remembered by survivors. They said the offensive had encountered difficulties. They said the enemy had responded more effectively than anticipated. They said weather conditions had been unfavorable. They said fuel shortages had limited exploitation of initial successes. What they didn't say, what they couldn't say while Hitler lived, was the simple truth that Rundstedt finally spoke in that January conversation. The offensive had been impossible from the start. They'd known it, they'd said it, and they'd been overruled. They'd attacked anyway because that's what soldiers do when ordered. And now Germany's last reserves were gone, consumed in a desperate gamble that had never had any real chance of success. The Ardennes Offensive was Germany's final major attack of the war. Within 4 months, Hitler would be dead, and Germany would surrender unconditionally. The forces destroyed in Belgium and the resources consumed, they were never replaced. The 6 weeks gained by disrupting Allied plans were ultimately meaningless. The offensive changed nothing strategically except to hasten Germany's defeat by consuming forces needed for defense. This was what German High Command realized in those cold December days when the skies cleared and the advance stopped and the Americans counterattacked. They'd played their last card and lost. Everything that followed was just epilogue to a defeat that had become inevitable the moment the first German soldier crossed the start line on December 16th, heading west toward objectives that were always beyond reach.